Hello and welcome to the 11th episode of the French Defense Speedrun series here. In this particular episode, we're playing against players in the rating range of 1600 to 1700 on chess.com's Rapid Chess Pool. And we're playing 3 different games. And in the first game, we're focusing on a variation where our opponent pushes their pawn up to the e5 square a little bit too early in the game. We're able to win the pawn, get a material advantage, and ultimately capitalize on that as the game progresses. In the second game, this one revolves around a lot of different interesting attacking concepts. We have an aggressive opposite side castling attack type of game. I talk about pawn hooks, pawn breaks, pawn storms, focal points when you're attacking, defending against opponents' pawn storms. So lots of attacking concepts that are pretty good to be aware of when you're playing those types of positions. In the third and final game, it's one where our opponent plays the advanced variation of the French defense. They do play it a bit inaccurately, though. They get themselves into some trouble and end up losing a little bit of material. But that particular game, I think, is very interesting because I go for an interesting queen sacrifice that ends up working out well in the game because the sacrifice allowed me to work towards pushing a pass pawn down the board. So if you like queen sacrifices, you'll probably like that third game for sure. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right into 3 games, and I hope you enjoy the video. All right, got our first game here. We're against Aha 9870 from Canada, rated 1647. Against E4, we're going for our French defense. And he goes for this E5 move, which we have seen at a lower rating range, but I think is going to be relatively rare above 1600. What I recommend against this is the move pawn to C5. We make it a bit more difficult for white to play D4 to reinforce the pawn. And if they try to play D4 anyways, we can just take the pawn, and then assuming the queen recaptures, we play knight c6. I think we've seen this exact position in one of the earlier games. And the problem is white just loses the pawn on e5. There's simply put no way for them to protect this pawn and keep it alive without losing something. If they go queen e4 or e3 or f4, we have queen a5 check, and then we take the pawn with the fork. And if the queen goes to c3, we have bishop to b4 making the pin. So in this case, white moves over to a4. This does stop the check, but it does just lose the pawn in the center of the board. Now, even though we're up a pawn, we are going to be behind on development a little bit because our knight is going to have to move around a couple of times. So we will have to still be a bit careful with how we respond here. So I'm going to go for the move knight to g6. I'm going to kind of turn the pressure back on the bishop. I'd be very happy to trade pieces here. White doesn't move the bishop, which is interesting. Okay, we are up a pawn. I think we're going to go for the trade. That's what I'm leaning towards. Wondering if there's anything else we can do. I think I'm going to go for the trade. White's going to recapture, I assume. Now, we do have to be a little bit careful about some knight to b5 and knight to e4 ideas. Knight to b5 threatening the fork on c7 could be a little bit tricky. And knight e4 going for the check on d6 could be a little bit tricky. But I think here, if we just react appropriately, I think we're going to be okay, is my impression. So the question is, though, how do we react? I think we're going to want to play a combination of like a6 and d5. Now, we have to order this correctly. If we go d5, I believe white goes knight to b5, and then the check on c7 becomes difficult to stop. I would generally prefer to develop a piece here, but I think once again, knight to b5 is still annoying. We do have d6. Maybe they castle, and then the rook is helping to hit the d-pawn. And it feels slightly tricky. Maybe there is ways to make that work, but I think I'm going to go for the move a6 because I really just don't want to... I just don't want to have to worry about this knight b5 jump, is really just what it comes down to. We're going to take away that idea. And then here I'm going to go ahead and develop the knight to f6. If I wanted to play for tricks and traps, I could play g6 trying to play bishop h6, but I don't think I really want to play g6 because maybe white plays like queen d4 or queen e5, and it's a little awkward to guard the rook. Plus, if the bishop goes to g7, then the square on d6 is weak. So I think I'm going to go for knight f6. If he goes knight e4, then I can trade, so that's generally good. I think d5 would be okay too, but I want to prioritize development when I'm this far behind. So I'm going to develop the knight. He develops his knight. I think I will focus on continuing to develop. I don't know if I want to go to c5 or to e7. c5 feels a little more aggressive, but it also feels like the bishop is a little bit more of a target. So I think I'm going to go for e7. Kind of, this is going to be a little bit similar to a different game in a different speedrun series. There was a game I played just before this one, but on the Ready Nimzo Larson speedrun that I'm also doing on YouTube. It was a very similar situation where we won a pawn very early in the game in that particular game in that different opening, and it's kind of a similar approach, trying to play a little bit more restrictive, you could say, because we're already up the pawn. We don't need to do anything fancy or drastic to be in good shape. I really just want to give my opponent the least amount of counterplay possible. Now that I'm thinking about it more, maybe d5 and then the bishop on d6 would have been even better. That might have been a bit better of a way of doing things. But okay, it is what it is. We're here now. I don't know if I want to castle kingside. White can play g4, and it gets a little tricky. I could go d6, bishop d7, move the queen, and try to castle queenside is maybe an option. That's kind of interesting. How do we want to do this? I could still play d5 here, and then kind of fix my mistakes, so to speak. I could try to play bishop d6. I'm kind of regretting my bishop on e7 now. I think I am going to go for d5. I might even waste a move going to d6 next, because I think it's better on d6 than it is on e7, quite honestly. Yeah, so he plays g4. I think I'm going to still play bishop d6. The tricky thing for him is he needs to move the queen somewhere that keeps the pawn protected, which I guess he can go to d4. Yeah, so I don't know. Maybe wasting time with the bishop, or with the moving the bishop again, is not the best. I don't really want to play bishop d7 and take away the escape score for the knight. I don't really want to put the knight on h5, because after queen g4, it feels like the knight just kind of gets frozen there. At least if I do that right away. I think I am going to go bishop d6. I assume he's going to play queen to d4. If he checks, I can block with the bishop. That's pretty good for me. I think going to d4 is his best move. And then I may then play bishop d7 or h6 or something like that. I'm not actually 100% sure. Plays knight e5. I don't think that's all that good, because now white's going to have a lot of trouble defending this knight. So the question is, what do we do about this? Queen c7, I guess there's queen a4 check, but then after bishop to d7... that doesn't seem like it works, though, because there is going to be some knight b5 or bishop b5 ideas taking advantage of my a6 pawn being pinned, so that's a little tricky. I could castle here. I could take on g4, but then he still checks, and then that gets awkward. I think I'm going to castle. So this check on a4 is sufficient enough of a problem that I'm going to do this and then play knight to d7 next after that. Or queen to c7. Okay, so I think queen c7 or knight d7. I think both of these are good. I'm not really sure if one is better than the other here. I have a feeling that developing a new piece can't be a bad idea. So let's do this. We develop the queen, we line up there, we threaten to take his knight. Rook e1 is the only way to protect the knight, but then we still can go knight to d7 and pile up on the pin piece. So I think white's just losing. They're down a pawn already, and now they're losing a piece. I think knight e5 was just a very big mistake from them. So yeah, not an easy position for white. I think instead of knight e5, like I said during the game, I think they should have played queen d4. So here we're going to go knight d7. We pile up on the knight. The pawn on f7 is defended, so we're not worried about that. And if they play h6 to try to attack me, I can play bishop takes knight and attack them. I don't need to react to their move right away. Knight takes pawn is protected. Knight b5 is protected. So there's really no way that white can make any sufficient attack or threat on my position. And he also can't defend the knight a third time either. So we're just going to take the knight. And then we can even take on c3 once we take the knight on e5. And yeah, then white's going to be in huge trouble after that. So I think that they've just made life for themselves very, very difficult by putting this knight on e5 and pinning themselves in the first place. I also don't think the opening phase is generally that great. I mean, he did lose the pawn on e5 on the 5th move of the game. But to his credit, he started creating some threats. He tried to attack on the king side, but I think he could have done this without walking into the pin. Because, again, we're going to take the knight, then we're going to take the other knight. We're going to blast open the king here, and black is completely winning in this position as far as I can tell. Moves the queen away. Okay. I'm still going to play bishop takes. And now I'm also threatening bishop to f4, giving a check and forking the king and the queen. So he could try h6, but then, yeah, bishop f4 check still wins the queen in this position. We win the queen with check. And, yeah, the game is over. We're up a full entire queen plus a pawn. He blocks with the rook. I think I can just go d4. He does have knight e2 to attack the queen, I suppose, but then I can just take the pawn. I can also just take the pawn as well. I think I'll do this, though. He does play knight e2. Queen g5 maintains the pin, but then he takes the pawn. I don't have a way to attack this rook as far as I'm aware, so I think I'll just take this pawn. Rook is hit. Queen e1 is also a mate threat. So, like, if he moves the rook over here, queen e1 is going to be checkmate. He has to play rook d3 to bring the rook back for defense. Okay, he does move the queen or the rook over, and we do get the checkmate. So that's it for this game. Let's analyze it. So he plays this this very early e5 move, which is really not all that great of a move. It's not a blunder by any means, but I do think after c5, pretty much we already won a pawn straight out of the opening just by playing the opening phase well and our opponent making some mistake. We counterattack the bishop, we trade pieces, develop the knight, develop the bishop. I think in hindsight, maybe pawn to d5 was a little bit better. But, okay, we went for bishop e7, then d5, then bishop d6, kind of got the bishop back to the square I really wanted it to be on in the first place. And then knight e5 was not so great. I guess if they are going to play knight e5, they should definitely move away from the pin at this point. I was thinking about playing, let's say, like queen to c7 first, but I thought that white could check on a4, and I thought this was a little bit annoying. If I block with the pawn, I suppose white can take this. But I guess in hindsight, even if they win the rook, I still win the knight. So this is probably still pretty good for black in the grand scheme of things. But, yeah, I didn't really want to have to calculate all of that. I just decided to castle, and then he didn't move away from the pin. He absolutely needs to play queen to d4 or queen to e3. He needs to move away from the pin so that he's not losing material. But yeah, in the game he lost the knight because it got pinned. Then he lost the queen, and that was that. So we get the win here. That's it for this one. Let's get into the next one. All right, we got our next game against Ayama 7, rated 1723 from France here, playing our French defense. French defense against a player from France. I think we had that coincidence happen at least once earlier in the speedrun. So our opponent goes for the exchange variation. We are going to develop our bishop to d6 here. They develop their bishop to d3. We're going to go for knight to e7, hinting at potentially playing bishop to f5. Now, I think in earlier episodes of the speedrun, I have castled kingside in this kind of position, which is absolutely fine to play. Castling and then bishop f5, it's a very equal way of playing the position. What I'm going to do here, I think I also recommend this as a potential approach in the French Simplified Chessable course. I'm actually going to go for the move knight to c6, and we're going to look to play this a little more aggressively this time. We're going to try to play bishop to g4, pinning the knight. Now the pawn on d4 is under pressure. White plays the move c3 to reinforce the pawn. But now we can play this move queen to d7. And we're going to try to castle queenside with the goal of pushing our pawns over on the king side to start up a pawn storm with an opposite side castling attack towards our opponent's king here. So they play the move h3. Let's go for the move bishop to h5. I think we'll just drop the bishop back to safety. We're going to maintain the pin. And after white plays bishop to g5, I think we will just castle queenside at this point. Could also throw in the move f6 right away. Might be fine to do. But I think I'll just castle queenside. I don't think there's all that much of a rush. And then, yeah, maybe pawn to f6, kick the bishop backwards, and then start to roll the g and h pawns down the board. One nice thing about this position is that white has played the move h3, so that means whenever we are able to get a pawn up to the g4 square, then it's going to be attacking not only the knight, but also the h3 pawn at the same time. So this pawn on h3 is known is what's called a hook, a pawn hook. If we get to g4, we're initiating a pawn trade or a pawn break. Lots of kind of terminology, interchanging words you could use for these things. But I think it's a position, or it's something in the position that helps us to attack a little bit easier, in my opinion. So the question is, do we go for h6 or f6? I like the look of f6, but h6 also looks good too, quite honestly. f6 has the benefit of keeping the e5 square under control, but it does have the disadvantage of weakening the e6 square. And maybe there's some scenarios where white can try to bring the queen down to e6 in order to trade the queens. So maybe I'll just go h6. Let's go for this approach. If the bishop retreats, then yeah, we're playing g5. If the bishop takes our knight, not the biggest deal in the world. We can just recapture with one of our pieces. And at the very least, we gain the pair of bishops. We gain the bishop pair advantage. So I don't know if it really matters which piece. I think I'm going to take with the knight. Yeah, let's take with the knight here. This also gets the knight away from pawn attacks over on the queen side as well. And yeah, I think now I'm going to go for g5. Yeah, let's go g5. And the plan is to play g4 and get the threats over on the king side. So I think we can go for it right away. I guess if we go for it immediately, there is knight to e5, which could be a little bit annoying. And then if I take the knight, the rook takes back, my bishop is hit. I will say that is a little bit annoying for sure. So what I will do here... How do we want to do this? Let's see. I'm also thinking about knight g6 to f4 or h4. Could be useful. But knight g6, maybe white plays g4 and traps the bishop. I don't know if that would be all that good for them, because we can take the pawn on g4 and get and weaken their king quite a lot. But it's at least something I'd have to be aware of. Let's put it that way. I think I'm going to try it, though. Let's go... Actually, no, I'm probably not going to do that. Knight g6, there's also queen to c2, and then bishop f5 is a pin, which is very annoying. So let's not do that. How do we want to do this? The fact that if I play g4, he has knight e5 is very annoying. So maybe I will end up playing f6 anyways. Maybe in hindsight, this mainly keeps the knight off of e5. In hindsight, this is kind of annoying that I could have played f6 then g5 and not had to play h6 in the meantime, but I don't know if it's the biggest deal in the world. Yeah, so I think I'm going to go for g4 now. If he takes the pawn, I will take with the queen, is my plan. And I'm taking with the queen mainly because I want to build pressure against the pawn on g2. So now I can move one of the rooks to the g8 square. He is rolling the pawns down the board. I think I'm going to use this rook. I don't know if it matters which rook all that much, quite honestly, but I'm going to use this rook here. Let's play rook to g8. Threaten mate. He's got to play bishop g2 to protect that. But But now he has some problems. This pawn on g2 is still pinned. This knight is also pinned. If the knight moves away, I can take the queen. I want to apply more pressure to the g2 pawn. So I'm thinking about knight g6 and then putting the knight on f4. And I think that that looks pretty good. Doesn't seem super easy for white to deal with that. This knight, if it moves, I will take the queen. Plays b6. I think I can just play a6 here. I don't really want to take the pawn and open up the a file for the rook, so I think I can just play a6 in this position. I could also maybe play knight f4 and ignore it. But if they take the pawn, they're also going to maybe promote. So let's play a6 first. And then knight f4 next move to attack the pawn on g2 here. And yeah, white has gotten a bit of a pawn storm on the queen side, but they're really not supporting those pawns with any of their pieces. I mean, this knight's pinned, this bishop is passive, this knight's stuck guarding the knight on f3, the rook is blocked by a pawn. So I think, like, here I don't even need to take the pawn. I can still just continue with knight f4 or knight h4 and continue attacking here as far as I can tell. Now the question is, does it matter which one I do? Knight h4 threatens the pawn and also still threatens the knight. Knight f4 mainly just threatens the pawn. If knight h4 and they take the knight, I take with the queen, threatening checkmate and threatening their queen, which looks quite good. So maybe I will go knight h4. Yeah, I'm threatening two things at once, which must be good. I can't really imagine why that would ever be bad. So they do take the knight. I could take the queen, but I think it's going to be better to play queen takes h4 here. Another possibility is checking with the bishop and then checking with the queen. But I think if I check and they move the king, we're probably getting about the same thing anyways. Like here, I think there's just not really a good way for white to stop both of these threats. If they block with the knight, I can just take the knight and then checkmate. So I think white's completely done for here. Yeah, they block with the knight, but I can just eliminate the knight and then checkmate on h2, as well as threatening the queen is the big problem for them. So yeah, this is the power that can be had of an opposite side castling attack, especially if you're doing a good pawn storm supported by pieces. White did actually get a pawn storm of their own on the queen side. They did b4, a4, a5, b5. They eventually got b6 in. But those pawns, like the difference between those, between the pawn storm that we went for in the game as black and the one that white went for, is that my pawn advances came with threats because I pushed the g pawn and attacked the knight at one point, and because white had played h3, the pawn breaks were easier for us to reach, and so white ends up resigning here. We're going to get checkmate or take the queen. There's not a whole lot they can do to stop it. Okay, let's go back and analyze this one. So we have an exchange variation, and I think white plays a very, let's say, like main line of the opening. I'm pretty sure that all of these moves are very, very common, and objectively, white is doing fine here. But I do think from a little bit of a practical perspective, this is a little bit dangerous for white for sure. Because if black starts to get this pawn storm going on the king side, as I said just a little bit earlier, our pawn advances come with more, maybe not more, but kind of faster threats, maybe is how I'd word it. If we can get the pawn up to g4, it takes only 2 moves to get there, assuming we kick the bishop away. But if we can go g5 and then g4, we not only attack the knight, but we also have a pawn, that this hook on h3 that we can latch onto, and that can help us to open up the g file quicker. If white pushes their pawn to b5, they do attack our knight, but there's no pawn hook. There's no trade of pawns that's occurring until they get one of their pawns all the way up to the b6 or a6 squares. And we saw in the game, white did eventually get their pawn to b6, and it did open up some lines around my king. But it just takes a lot longer for them to do that than it does for us to attack on the king side. Now, I will say, part of this is because white played h3. I don't think white should play h3 for the same reason as what we said was the benefit of black's attack, you could say. Like, if white doesn't play h3, maybe they just play bishop g5, castle, and let's say we give them the same moves in the game, but without the h3 move. So knight to d2, maybe we go h6, they take, we take, they go b4, maybe we go g5, a4, f6, like something like this. I'm not sure. Like essentially, even if we move the bishop away and try to get ready for g4, the big difference again is because the pawn's not on h3, there's no way for us to open up a file very quickly. And this version of the position is actually like totally fine for white. The computer actually says white's quite a bit better here, mainly because bishop e6 is not a good move. But black would have a bit of a harder time breaking open the king side in this position compared to what happened in the game. In the game, because white played h3, this gave us this great opportunity to eventually get the pawn up to g4. And once we got the pawn to g4 and the pawns got traded, then the g file opened up, and then I think white's in pretty big trouble at this point, because we put the rook on g8, we swing the knight around, and this is also a very important attacking concept. Whenever you are attacking your opponent's king, you want to, especially if their king is not wide open just yet, I will say, you want to try to pick a what's known as a focal point around the king. So a square or a pawn that is very close to the king in terms of just like location. And you want to try to figure out which of those squares or pawns you can pile up the most amount of attackers on. And ideally, that's also a square or pawn that the opponent doesn't have an easy time defending a bunch of times. So in this position, because we opened up the g file, it definitely is the case that the pawn on g2 is the focal point of our attack. We want to try to maneuver as many pieces as we can to attack the g2 pawn. And so we put the rook on g8, and then eventually we put the knight on h4, and now white runs out of ways to defend against the threats, and white is in big trouble here. Probably what white should be doing in these positions earlier on, I don't think white should take the pawn. The move I was a little more concerned about was maybe a move like knight to h4. And the reason that this particular move is a little bit tricky is because the pawn on g4 is actually pinned. So if I move the pawn, they will just take the bishop, which is bad news for us. I think I would have still played rook to g8, maybe put the rook on g5 to guard the bishop, and we can definitely still continue the attack. But this would have at least stalled us out for a little bit longer because we don't open up the g file as quickly in this case. Whereas if white takes the pawn, we're immediately bringing pieces to the g file, and I think white's position is already very dangerous. Now, to white's credit, they were trying to do their own pawn storm on the queen side, as I said earlier, but they just really never got it going the way that they would have liked to. They pushed pawns, but there's no pieces supporting this. And so all it really took was one move from us, and we can ignore the pawn on c7. We go back to our own attack. We get a very nice win here. And I think this is a nice game that shows the power of like opposite side castling, as well as pawn storms, attacking a focal point. I think it's a pretty good example of a well-played attacking game for the most part. So anyways, though, that's it for this game. Let's go ahead and get into our next one. All right, we got our third game here. After e4, we're playing e6. We're playing against Sayed, 68, rated 1672 from Armenia. So we're going for our French defense. They go for the advanced variation here, so we are going to play c5 to strike at the center. They play c3 to reinforce the center. Here I recommend going for queen to b6 with the plan of playing bishop d7 to b5, looking to exchange off the bad bishop in this position and trying to fix that kind of problem that we tend to have in most French defense positions. So our opponent goes for a3. Against the move a3 here, we can definitely consider throwing in the move a5. Part of the idea with a3 is white might want to play the move b4, trying to challenge our pawn that's on the c5 square. So a5 is a possibility to try to work around that. The slight drawback to a5 is you do weaken the b5 square, and if white does something like, I don't know, maybe pawn to a4 one day, then it's going to be a little bit harder for us to trade the bishop off on the b5 square. So that being said, I think we can actually just go ahead and play bishop to b5, bishop to d7 with the idea of playing bishop to b5 afterwards anyways. And if he does play b4, we can trade the pawns and then play bishop to b5 again. So let's just stick to the script here. We go for bishop to d7. Let's see what white decides to do in response. He does play b4. Now, I don't want to take on b4. I think this would actually be... I think it's possible, I suppose, but I think it's also a little bit risky at the same time. If we take on b4, white does have the option of recapturing with the a pawn. And if he recaptures with the A pawn, then it ends up that the pawn on d4 is very well secured because this pawn on c3 is protecting it. The real weakness in white's position, if we took the b4 pawn and they took back with the a pawn, the real weakness would end up being the c3 pawn, which is not the easiest pawn in the world for us to attack with a bunch of pieces. However, if we trade pawns on d4 and they recapture with the pawn, then there's no pawn on c3, and the d4 pawn ends up still being a little bit of a weakness in the position in the long run. So we're going to make that particular capture instead of taking on b4. And then we're still going to go for bishop to b5, looking to trade off the light square bishop. If white takes, we'll take back, we'll retreat the queen, and then we'll play around the slight weakness that white has with the pawn on d4. So knight to e2 is an interesting option. It does block off the ability for us to trade pieces right away. At the same time, it does have the drawback of, again, just blocking in the bishop. So it might be possible for us to just go ahead and play something like knight to c6. And then we are actually threatening to take the knight, followed by knight takes or queen takes on d4. Now, if I go knight c6, I'm going to assume white's going to bring the other knight to c3. But then in that situation, I think I can still take the knight on e2 just to trade off our bad bishop. That would force them to take back with the knight to guard the pawn. And then I think we can play a move like a5 and really try to blast open the queen side. And that looks pretty good for me, in my opinion. So I think we're going to go that route. The threat is to take this knight. Even if white plays knight c3, we'll still take it. Plays bishop to b2. That's also a possibility. But I think now I'll still play the move pawn to a5. I don't really want to take on e2 until white plays knight c3 is what it comes down to. So I'll go pawn to a5. This is a pretty typical move when your opponent has the pawn on b4. You're using this pawn break in order to open up lines on the queen side. I think it would have also been fine to go knight e7, planning to play knight f5. That's also a very normal way of developing the pieces. But white plays knight c3, so white doesn't really address the fact that I'm attacking the b4 pawn a ton of times. And I think because of that, we can either take on b4 right away, or we can take the knight on e2 first, followed by taking the pawn on b4. I'm leaning towards taking the knight first, but maybe that's not even necessarily the best case situation. Let's see here. If I take on e2, I do kind of help white to develop a new piece. Maybe they take back with the bishop. And then there it is possible to take on b4, or sorry, it is possible to take on d4, I suppose. Which looks pretty decent at the end of the day. But also if I take on e2, it's possible to take on b4. That also still looks pretty good. But the other option is to take on b4 right away. If white takes back with the pawn, we can trade the rooks, then take with the bishop and pin their knight. That looks pretty good. If white instead takes the bishop on b5, we can recapture. The slight drawback there is we do allow white some discovered attacks towards our queen, but I don't really know if the knight can go anywhere that's all that bothersome. And I think white's still going to have, they're still going to be down the pawn because we're taking the pawn on b4 for free, essentially. So, quite honestly, I'm not 100% sure between these two moves which to go for. I'm going to go for the capture on e2 because I'm going to try to make each of my moves come with threats. Let's put it that way. If they take back with the bishop, it is possible to take d4, but I think I'm going to take on b4 first. If they do recapture, we'll end up trading the rooks and then take with the bishop on b4. And the pawn on d4 is always going to be a bit of a sore spot or weakness in white's position. So here they play knight to a4. They counterattack the queen on b6. I think I can go ahead now and play queen to a5, it looks like, to attack the knight on a4. And if they take the pawn on b4, I'll take back with the bishop making a check on the king. And then white will have to move the king to f1, which doesn't really seem like a great situation. My main threat right now is to take the knight on a4, so I do think white kind of has to take, or move the knight. Okay, this is a possibility. I don't think this is that great of a possibility, though, because we are able to take the pawn on a3 with a discovered check, and then we are attacking that bishop. Now, I'm not sure if we should throw in the capture of the knight first. I kind of feel like it might be useful just to go ahead and do that. So, I don't know. Let's see. If I take on a3, if the queen blocks, I think I can just take on b2 there, and then I can promote the pawn. The other option is for the king to move, and then if I take the bishop on b2 there, they take me, I take back. I think I'm just going to eliminate the knight. Quite honestly, I'm not sure if it makes a huge difference. We're going to take this way now with a discovered check. And I'm assuming the king is going to move. I think I can still take the bishop anyways here, which is interesting. I don't have to do that. I could play queen takes c5 and just be up 3 pawns, which also looks quite good. That looks really, really good. But I think I might be able to take the bishop. They get the queen, I take back with the rook, and then it's actually pretty tough for white to deal with my rook coming down to the a1 square. That looks like a difficult problem to solve. I suppose they could play bishop d3 and then block on b1. But maybe then I can even play rook takes c5 and the pawn on b2 helps me to play rook c1. So I don't think it's necessary to take on b2. Once again, I think if we take on c5, we're just up 3 pawns for free. But I do think it works to take on b2, and I think I'm going to try it. I think I'm going to try it out here. Let's just see how it goes. So he's going to take my queen, of course. I'm going to take back with the rook. And the threat here right now is to play rook a1, pinning the queen. I think he absolutely has to play bishop to d3. I think this move is pretty much mandatory. And then I think I was going to take with the rook on c5, trying to get the rook to the c1 square. I think that's what I'm kind of angling for here. Because if they go bishop d3 and I make the pin, they can block with their bishop. Even that looks fine. As long as I develop the rest of my pieces, I think we should be in pretty good shape. Even though we did lose our queen, we gained a rook, a knight, and 2 extra pawns. So we are actually up 1 point in material here. But if white is able to eliminate my b2 pawn somehow, then my advantage will diminish a bit. So he does play bishop d3, so I think it was good for him to find this move. I think I'm going to take with the rook on c5. This was what I had in mind. And the idea here is I am now threatening rook to c1. And another problem that white's always going to have to face is even if they do move the queen away, I can check and take the rook on h1. Here white plays bishop to c2 to block off my rook, but now I think I can go knight to b4, and I think then white's going to have trouble dealing with the attack on the bishop as far as I can tell. So let's go knight to b4. Yeah, I think we'll do this here. If the bishop moves, we have rook to c1. If he throws in a check, I can even play pawn to b5 to block that off. Or move the king away somewhere would also be probably fine. And then again, it's very difficult for white to stop the move rook to c1. So he plays queen to b1, which does block the pawn. However, I can take with the rook on c2, and now rook to c1 is still pretty much impossible for him to stop. And if you have, of course, my rook is protected by the knight, and now, yeah, rook to c1 looks like it's going to be game over next move. White cannot get the king off of the back rank. He can't castle because he's already moved the king once. The queen also can't move anywhere. Yeah, there's nothing white can do. We're going to play rook to c1 next moving, and we're going to promote the pawn or win the queen. All of those results end up being very nice for us. Okay, so interesting game. From the opening phase, we play against the advanced variation. Our opponent goes for c3. We go queen to b6, a3, bishop d7, b4. We trade on d4. We offer the exchange of bishops. And yeah, white shows this interesting move with knight to e2. The idea that they're going for is they're trying to avoid that trade of bishops. However, I think after we continue developing with knight to c6, I think we're in pretty good shape. Maybe I could have also played pawn to a5 right away. That might have also been good to go for even quicker. But okay, we went knight c6, then a5. And I think white's already in a bit of a tough position here, because defending the pawn is pretty much impossible, and taking the pawn is really not all that great either, because I think here, I think I would take with the knight, maybe? And then maybe my knight can end up on c4. I can develop this other knight to f5. I can put a rook on the c file. And I think white's in a tough spot here. I'm also threatening maybe to take the knight and attack the bishop on b2. In the game, white decided to not protect the pawn at all. We made the exchange of pieces, took on b4, and I think we're in pretty good shape here. It might have also been possible, as I was talking about during the game, maybe taking on b4 first is also pretty good. If they take our bishop, we take back, we are still up a pawn here as well. So I think being up a pawn in either situation is pretty good. Knight to a4 is maybe not the best response. Probably white should take the pawn. I think I was going to trade the rooks and then take the pawn on b4. Maybe white castles. If they throw in a check, I can always block with my knight. And I think something like this is pretty interesting. I am up a pawn, and especially if I can castle next move, I think we're going to be in pretty good shape. But maybe white can throw in a check, and maybe they can try to harass us and create some threats and stir up some danger. But I think we're still in pretty good shape here. We can block with the other knight on c6, and we are up a pawn at the end of the day, which is pretty good. So anyways, though, he played knight a4 in the game. I played queen a5. Now the knight on a4 is hit. They played knight to c5. We eliminate the knight. We take on a3 with check. And then we took on b2. And I don't think this was necessary to do. I think queen takes c5 would have also still been a very large advantage. We're up 3 pawns, as it is. But I thought that this was an interesting way of doing things, where we do lose the queen, but white has a very hard time dealing with the rook getting down to the c1 or a1 squares. So the bishop went to d3, we took on c5, hit the bishop. I think it was probably best for white to play something like maybe queen to b3, allow us to... Oh, okay. I was going to say allow us to take the rook and try to counterattack, but actually instead of taking the rook, we can even go knight to d4 check and take the queen. So actually, that would actually backfire pretty badly for white. So yeah, if that's not really available, I don't really know if there's a great way to deal with our impending rook to c1 idea. King to e2, we still go rook to c1. If the queen goes to b3, we have the same fork. If the queen comes out this way, probably we just take the rook. I guess they can check. Maybe this is a little messy because white starts to attack us pretty quickly. Here we might actually just be getting checkmated, which is kind of a funny looking checkmate, but it does work nonetheless. So maybe here, instead of taking the rook on h1, we might have to just prioritize our own development with a move like knight to e7. And if we get to castle, we're definitely better off here for sure. But this would have at least been a little bit more of a tenacious opportunity for our opponent. Bishop c2 allowed us to attack the bishop. We won the bishop. The rook is going to c1. White ended up resigning here, and we got the win. All right, so that's going to be it for our third game of this episode. We focused on 3 different games, playing the French defense once again, and in this rating range, we were playing against players from 1600 up to 1700. Hopefully you enjoyed these 3 games, and I will see you in the next video and in the next episode.